When the attacker attempts an orbital jam, they send signals directly to the satellite via a rogue uplink. The jamming signals can either replace the legitimate signals or mix with the original. In either case, the whole legitimate signal is compromised. These Fortnet devices are full of vulnerabilities. All right. And if you just go onto CV's database and look at all the vulnerabilities, it's disturbing how many vulnerabilities they have. And so, a lot of people, they build their network around a VPN, a virtual private network. And the virtual private network is designed to give you security, right?
Now, how many times have you found yourself doom scrolling, trapped in the bottomless pit of TikTok videos or other social media posts? Social media apps purposely keep you stuck in a loop, in my opinion, often wasting your time. Now, rather than being sucked into time-wasting social media apps, rather spend your time learning something new every day with Brilliant. Brilliant teaches you by doing. You are involved in your learning rather than just passively watching someone else lecturing you and probably putting you to sleep. Rather learn by doing with Brilliant's interactive lessons in data science, programming, and much, much more. Now, data is everywhere. Brilliant's data science courses let you dive into real-world data sets from companies like Airbnb and Spotify so that you can see trends and make informed decisions. Now, even if you're a beginner, you can start with some basic examples and then build up to mastering regression models and algorithms. I personally recommend that you check out the Exploring Data Visually course. This course turns intimidating data sets into stories you can actually understand and use. Start building your daily learning habit today with Brilliant. Sign up at brilliant.org/David Bombal for a free 30-day trial and get 20% off an annual subscription. Click on the link in the video description or scan this QR code to get started. Everyone, it's David Bombal back with the amazing OTW. OTW, great to have you back on the channel.
David, it's always an honor to be on the best IT and cybersecurity channel on YouTube. And I mean that.
I really appreciate that. And I mean, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge. And I keep mentioning his books, but if you haven't seen these before, you should go and buy this book. This is Linux Basics for Hackers. Fantastic book if you want to learn about Linux from a hacker's perspective. We've also done a whole bunch of videos, which I'll link below if you want to see OTW explain the book in video format. He's also written this book, Network Basics for Hackers. So if you want to learn about networking from a hacker's perspective, that's a great book. And another great one is Getting Started Becoming a Master Hacker. OTW, really looking forward to this. I know you've been teaching a bunch of satellite hacking courses, but I don't want to spoil it. What are you going to show us today?
Well, today what I would like to do is to talk about satellite hacking in general, and then look very specifically at one particular satellite hack. It may be the first time that we've seen a satellite hack being used in cyber war. Okay, so you probably remember that at the beginning of the Ukraine war, right, that there was the Viasat system was knocked out in Ukraine. So let's talk a little bit about just satellite hacking in general, and then we'll look very specifically at what happened in that particular attack. And also I want to talk a little bit in this context of cyber threat intelligence. So one of the things that is maybe underrated is that there is a field called cyber threat intelligence, where there are people whose job it is to be on the lookout for new attacks and then be able to adapt the network, adapt the defenses so that they don't get hacked. And in this case here, in the Viasat hack, there was all kinds of warnings out there. And in this case, the attackers, which is, we're pretty clear it was Russia, used a 4-year-old vulnerability, against the system. It was a 4-year-old vulnerability against the system. And so if somebody had been paying attention, then it may have never happened. So let's talk a little bit about satellite hacking.
So OTW, I just have to inject here. This is something I see a lot on YouTube, right? People say, this is dumb. This is an old hack. It'll never be used today. But this is another example of that, right?
This is another example. It's one of the reasons why I want to talk about it, because exactly that. I get that from people all the time on YouTube, on Twitter, and they're like, why are we doing this old hack? Well, here's a good example of one that had been around for 4 years, and it played a critical role in a cyber warfare attack against, in this case, against Ukraine, but it could be your country, whatever country you're residing in, because these vulnerabilities don't always get patched, even when there's all kinds of warning signs like there was with this one here. And the Viasat is actually an American company. So it isn't actually, it wasn't Ukraine who failed to patch. It was actually the American company, and it was their Italian subsidiary in Turin that actually got attacked. And it got attacked through the VPN, right? We'll talk about that, because this attack is actually a pretty simple attack. It's one of those attacks that, if you're a beginner web app hacker, you've probably actually done this attack before, something very similar to it. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's talk first about the ways that satellites can be attacked, because this is going to be a major vector being used in any type of cyber warfare, and for that matter, in cyber attacks in general, is these satellites. These satellites are becoming more and more prolific. We know that, for instance, that SpaceX, has 40,000. Starlink is a SpaceX subsidiary, has 40,000 satellites, all in low orbit. The old technology was to put satellites way, way high in the sky, and they would cover geostationary orbit, right? But now the new way is to put them in low Earth orbit, very close to the Earth. The advantages of that is that you get very low latency. So if you put a satellite 20,000 miles into the sky, the amount of time that it takes to communicate is going to be slowed down, right? Yeah. So as these satellites become, more and more ubiquitous in our daily lives, this is going to be more and more important in cyber warfare, in cyber crime. That's why we at Hackers Arise have begun to address this, and we now have we're going to put together a series of courses. We ran our first satellite hacking course just recently. So let's talk about the different ways that these satellites can be hacked. There's different strategies here, okay? So probably the first one we want to talk about is simply jamming. This is probably the best known, in some ways the easiest attack to execute, right? In the attack, the adversary, the attacker, floods or overpowers a signal, a transmitter, or a receiver, right? So do any of those, it can be the target. In this way, the signal never arrives or is so seriously damaged as to be very limited practical use. One of the other things I want to mention is that at least in the United States, right, is that the major cell phone carriers are beginning to offer satellite services on their cell phones. Okay, so the new Google Pixel and Verizon phones are offering satellite services. Now, they're only offering text messages, through the satellite service. So if you're on a mountaintop someplace that has no cell service, you can still text, right? So we're getting more and more of these services that are going through low Earth orbit satellites. So if you've got the brand new Google Pixel phone, you can text. The reason it's only text is that these satellites are only accepting very small bandwidth messages. And text messages are very, very small. They don't take much space, right? Yeah. If you're talking or you're navigating the internet, that takes a lot more data. Text message is very, very small. So they're enabling these phones to connect to satellites that allow you to text from anywhere on the planet. And the reason I mention this is simply to show that we're getting more and more satellite services coming to our everyday lives. Many of you probably already have Starlink. You might have satellite TV. There's a lot of different satellite services. The militaries use satellite service to communicate to their ships and their airplanes around the globe, right? So these satellites are being more ubiquitous in our lives than they were in the past. And that's why we're addressing the subject. Okay. So in terms of jamming a satellite signal, the key is the strength of the signal, right? So, if whoever shouts the loudest is the one who gets heard, right? That's basically what's going on here. So many satellite signals are very weak. GPS is very weak, for instance. And that's why GPS, for instance, both in the Israeli-Palestine war and in the Ukraine-Russian war, GPS is being jammed, right? Let me show you what's happening. Let me give you, just to kind of give people an idea that I'm just not making this stuff up. There's actually a website that tracks GPS jamming, right, around the world, and I'll show it to you. So this is showing us the level of GPS interference. So you can see the hot spots around the globe. These are the high, red spots, okay, are where we have GPS jamming going on, right? And so this is an everyday occurrence in 2024, is GPS jamming. And you've probably read online that there's been some issues with flights, particularly up here, of commercial flights losing their GPS signal or getting improper or incorrect signals from GPS. The reason is that GPS only uses about 50 watts. Okay, that's not a whole lot, right? That's something that you can generate even as an amateur in this field, right? So
that's a cool site.
Yeah. So you can see almost most of Europe is clear, except for along those hot areas. We can also categorize these jamming attacks into these types. There's orbital jamming and terrestrial jamming. So terrestrial being Earth, right? Orbital being where the satellite's at. Okay. When the attacker attempts an orbital jam, they send signals directly to the satellite via a rogue uplink. The jamming signals can either replace the legitimate signals or mix with the original. In either case, the goal of the legitimate signal is compromised. When the attacker attempts terrestrial jamming, they send rogue signals at the same frequencies as the satellite signal to the ground station. Right? So these satellite systems, they have ground stations, right, that send signals up. Okay, if you as a user of satellite signals, you're basically just sending and receiving through a router, okay, some type of network device. But these ground stations, okay, are actually operated by the satellite companies. If one can attack the ground stations and take control of these ground stations, it's possible to send, for instance, malware up through the satellite. So you took control of the ground station, then once you have control of the ground station, you can then send malware up to the satellite, and then it'll send malware into everybody's router and possibly even their computer who's connected to that router, right? Here, the attacker is targeting the ground station rather than the satellite to interfere with the successful transmission. You can buy small portable jammers that have a range of 3 to 5 kilometers. Okay, this can be done via an SDR with significant amplification. The SDRs have very low power, but if you amplify them, you need significant amplification. Flooding an uplink to the satellite can have the most impact because it can actually damage the satellite components and limit the transmission to all possible recipients, while a jamming attack against a terrestrial station is reversible and only affects those in the immediate area. Now, this is actually a commercial satellite jammer that you too can buy. No, actually, you can't buy it. No, you can't. It's actually it's an American company who sells these things. And they say they only sell them to governments and militaries and police departments. It's law enforcement. But this is a device that is designed specifically for this purpose. So we're not talking theoretical here. We're talking about something that's very real that governments, militaries, law enforcement are using around the world. So if they wanted to cut off, for instance, your Starlink access, they could put one of these in your neighborhood and basically jam all of the signals in your neighborhood or your town, right? And that's what these are designed for. Now, you probably remember that in any of these war zones, that this type of jamming can become a critical element, okay, in protecting and also attacking the enemy. So that's what these are sold for. They're out there. They're expensive. It says its system uses broadband directional antennas for selective jamming area. Get more info here. You too can have a model EW1600. And this thing puts out about 1,200 watts to give you some idea of the signal strength. About 1,200 watts. It puts out 1,200 watts at L1, L2, and L5. And those who are familiar with satellite frequencies, those are the frequencies that are often used by satellite phones. Inmarsat operates there. Iridium operates there. L1 and L2 are the old frequencies. L5 is the new frequency, and this thing will do all of them. Anyway, moving on. So you can also uplink. You can do the jamming of the uplink. The control can possibly prevent a satellite from receiving commands from its control station. Right? It's important to note that the uplink jammer must have equal or greater signal power as the signal is trying to jam, and it must be located within the ground footprint of the satellite. So these satellites are moving. They're orbiting the Earth, and they have a very limited footprint as they pass over the Earth. So when jamming, you would have to jam within that footprint, or maybe a better way to think of it is kind of like a shadow. So their shadow is constantly traveling across the Earth. So the jam would have to come when the satellite was in the area, in the footprint or the shadow of the satellite. Satellite jamming can be done with inexpensive off-the-shelf components. Unlike jamming, eavesdropping, and this is one of the things that is pretty easy to do with off-the-shelf SDR equipment, is simply to intercept the messages. Right? So listen into them. And this is, I've got to point out, this is illegal. Right? So do not do this, right? But it's possible. It can be done. You can listen in to these satellite phones and text messages. It's possible. It's done pretty simple because the satellites are picking up and sending transmissions, as they're passing over the Earth. Much of it's encrypted, but some of it's not encrypted. Of course, the not encrypted part is the part that is easily and readily available. If it's encrypted, then you're going to have to do some work on decrypting. Some of the transmissions are not encrypted because encryption requires more horsepower, requires more computing power, more CPU cycles, and it can degrade the signal dramatically by encrypting. It can also hijack and control these satellites. This is kind of an interesting one down below here, that there's some old US Navy satellites that are out there that people are using like their personal CB radios, okay? And it's very popular in Brazil. So these satellites are cruising at 22,000 miles above the Earth, and they're actually decommissioned satellites that people are bouncing signals off. These are basically old satellites that all they did was repeat, okay? They're just repeaters. So the Navy built them to be able to send signals around the curvature of the Earth to their ships and their airplanes. And these things they're old technology, but they're still flying up there. They're still in orbit. And so people are sending signals to these satellites and using them like CB radios. And we've seen this to be very popular in Russia and in Brazil, both, because it allows a company to be able to communicate to, say, trucks all over a very large area like Brazil and Russia is. It's, once again, this is illegal, but nobody seems to be doing anything about it.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and this actually operates at 270 megahertz. All right, so if you go and you're just putting out your SDR, you'll see this signal at about 270 megahertz. So it's a low frequency signal. It also, to be able to send the signal and receive the signal, you're going to need a sophisticated antenna. You can see the signal, but you can't really pick it up and hear it or transmit to it unless you have a very large antenna, right? Because these low frequencies require very large antennas. I want to refer you to our article on Hackers Arise on different types of antenna and antenna technology.
That's great.
Because different signals require different antennas, right? And different size antennas, right? So to control a satellite, the attacker must breach the tracking, telemetry, and control, the TTC links. This includes the ground station, the bus, and the payload. The malicious commands are sent because these satellites obviously are being controlled by a ground station, right? Yeah. And so if you can go ahead and attack the satellite, okay, and send similar signals, okay, as the ground station, or take control of the ground station, then all you have to do sometimes is just change the attitude, okay, of the satellite, just tilt it a little bit so that it no longer can send and receive, or it can't get the energy it needs, because these are all being run by solar panels. And one of the things I think is kind of important to note is that the whole solar panel industry was built to power satellites. Right? That's why we have a solar power industry. So when the first satellites came out in the 1950s, they had, we got to have a power source, right? And so that's where the PV, the photovoltaic industry, grew out of powering satellites. So all these satellites are using photovoltaics, PVs, the things that you see on people's rooftops and what have you. But they have to point at the sun, obviously, right? That's the photovoltaics that be put. So if an attacker can turn the satellite just slightly so it doesn't get the sunlight, then it's basically going to be a flying brick. Right? The malicious commands are sent to the satellite that conceivably alter the position and attitude of the satellite. Okay, this is among the most difficult types of attacks, but has been successful on rare occasions, such as 2008 attack against the NASA Terra EOS satellite and the Landsat satellite. These attacks have been seen; they've been done. In general, in military circumstances, ground stations are really well secured, not necessarily in commercial. So let's talk about the Viasat attack now. Right? This is an interesting attack that took place just 2 years ago. Right? And at the very beginning of the war, Ukraine found itself in the dark. Right? So almost all of its internet communication was knocked out. So at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war, we had this, essentially it was like a DDoS attack, where they basically knocked out the internet service of Ukraine. Many of the people, the government, the military, and civilians use Viasat. It's an American company once again, but they cover the globe, right? In many previous invasions, okay, Russia has used DDoS attacks. This is common, right? And you could say maybe even this most recent attack against Hezbollah, right, was essentially a DDoS attack. It knocked out their communications. This is common technique. This is a common military strategy. So the Russians do this whenever they attack anybody. They do a DDoS attack. We have Georgia in 2008. We have an attack against Estonia. And so they did something similar, okay, in this case against Ukraine, except they attacked the satellite signal. That's what makes this different. Viasat's an American communication company operating across the globe, including Ukraine. All right. On February 24th, 2022, the day Russia launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, the system was hacked, leaving thousands of Europeans. So it wasn't just Ukraine without internet access. The greatest number of these were in Ukraine. The attacker used a poorly configured VPN to gain access to the trusted segment of the network with the management consoles. The attackers used CVE 2018-13379 against a Fortnet firewall. So this kind of goes, remember, this is 2022. They're using a 4-year-old vulnerability in Fortnet VPN. Hopefully Fortnet doesn't sponsor your show.
Not this one, no.
Do they sponsor any of your shows?
No, not at the moment. But you can say whatever you like. It doesn't matter.
I'll say what I think. These Fortnet devices are full of vulnerabilities. All right. And if you just go onto CV's and CV database and look at all the vulnerabilities, it's disturbing how many vulnerabilities they have. And so, a lot of people, they build their network around a VPN, a virtual private network. And the virtual private network is designed to give you security, right? That's what it's designed for. It's a cybersecurity device. It's a cybersecurity strategy, right? So you get an encrypted tunnel between your machine and the internal network. And Fortnet makes a lot of these, and they have been riddled with problems in recent years. So here's a good example. Viasat was using a Fortnet VPN firewall as a combination device, and this was a 4-year-old vulnerability.
Occupy the Web and anyone else who comes on the channel, I don't restrict what you say. You can say whatever the heck you want. And I think it's really important that I don't try and limit what people say. And I mean, if you want to bash vendors, then feel free, man. It's the information's out there anyway. I mean, there's so many CVEs, so go for it.
So here's the vulnerability, all right, that is described by the CVE. And like I was saying, is that this is a relatively simple attack. It's a path traversal. On day one of your web app hacking course, you learned that sometimes you can actually move from the default directory that the web server that you land in the web server and move to other directories on the server. All right, by going .. .. right? You've probably seen that attack. That's what this was, right? It was one of the most simple attacks, right, that you learn on day one of web app hacking. So, when you're taking your 101 course in web app hacking, and you see this, you go, that never works. I tried it. It never works.
Your first mistake, yeah.
It does work in some cases. Okay. It worked 2 years ago against a big company, Viasat, right? Or Fortnet and Viasat both, right? So what they did is they simply they moved within the directories of the server. And by moving into the different directories in the server, they found the password, username and password. Right? So it says under the SSL VPN web portal allows an unauthenticated attacker, anybody, to download system files via a specially crafted HTTP resource request. And those include the username and password.
Mad. Absolutely mad.
Absolutely mad, right. Base score 9.8, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, right? This is about as serious as you can get in terms of a vulnerability. Knowing that, you would think that everybody would patch their systems immediately, but they didn't. And even worse is that there was all kinds of warning signs out there if somebody was doing cyber threat intelligence, right, to see what's going on. Here's a description of the exploit that was described by Arista Labs, okay, in 2021. So it's the year before the attack. So here's an executive summary of the attack they saw. Arista's NDR Labs teams responded to a cybersecurity incident involving one or more of the actors that have been active since at least January 2021. At least one of the attacks leveraged a critical vulnerability. This one we're talking about, the CVE 2018-13379, in an external-facing FortiGate appliance to harvest VPN and Active Directory credentials, including some highly privileged domain administrator accounts. Persistence was achieved through newly created rogue domain accounts, and scheduled tasks were launched by Cobalt Strike Beacon. Lateral movement was achieved primarily through common tools such as Microsoft Remote Desktop and PS Exec. Right? So this is a year before the attack, right, against Viasat. Then, on the day before the attack, okay, February 23, 2022, right, this is bad packets, okay, and they detected, all right, mass scanning activity detected from, okay, 5118, 159, 169, right? That's actually St. Petersburg, Russian Federation, targeting Fortnet VPN servers vulnerable to unauthenticated arbitrary file reads, leading to disclosure of username and passwords in plain text. That's the other bad part about this, is that the username and passwords were stored in plain text, not encrypted. Yep. Okay, this is 2022.
Yep.
And we have devices storing username and passwords in plain text in 2022.
And internet facing. Mad.
And internet facing. And so you can see here, this is like, once again, this is web app hacking 101. You can see the .. // .. / .. .. / So they're moving to to different directories within the device to arrive at the directory that has the username and passwords, okay, in plain text. All right. So if somebody at Viasat had been doing good cyber threat intelligence, they would have seen this. This is still on this particular, if you go on Twitter, this was actually on Twitter. This was actually the night before the attack. They were seeing these scans, okay, from this IP address, and they announced it to the world, okay? And if somebody had been doing their job, then this attack never would have taken place. So the proof of concept for this attack is on GitHub. I've shown it to you right here. There's also a Metasploit module, the same exploit, right? So anybody can do this. Yep. So once the attackers, so what they did, obviously got the username and passwords. This was the control panel, okay? This was the management panel for the satellite, right? So this management panel was used for a lot of different things, including being able to send firmware updates to the routers that receive the message. So these are internet routers. They're routers that are used to send and receive your internet traffic. So those things have to be updated periodically. So the management panel is the device that's used to update those devices, right? So the attackers got inside the panel. They got the username and password, right, from the Fortnet device. And then once they had that, they went to the management panel, and then they uploaded malware as an update, okay, to the devices, to the routers. And then that malware overwrote the flash memory in those internet routers, right? The satellite itself wasn't touched, basically. The satellite was simply used as a medium to move from the management panel to all the thousands of routers in Ukraine, in Germany, in Poland, a number of other places were affected by this as well. So they just sent up the malware as a, you could kind of call this as maybe a supply chain attack as well, right? Because basically they're taking over. It's a lot like maybe the solar winds attack. The solar winds attack is when the patches and the updates to the solar wind software was basically compromised by attacking the update server. Okay? In this case here, they attacked the management console, which is the way that these, among other things, is the way that the updates are sent to these routers. And they just sent malware that basically wiped the memory. And so basically, anybody's router who was affected could no longer communicate to the satellites, right? The firmware was corrupted, basically. So the satellite was unharmed, but the users were unable to connect. And this is kind of the life cycle. So we saw the IP address and credentials reconnaissance. So they basically were scanning. This would be using Nmap or mass scan, ZMAP, what have you, to scan all the IP addresses looking for Fortnet devices. And then use the internet to access IP addresses of the Earth gateway centers. This one that they did find was in Turin, Italy. Then they exploited the VPN, okay, to pass through the DMZ. Then they select specific beam spots. Okay, so they selected which devices they wanted to send the malware to, send the signals to the modems, exploit the VPN vulnerability to access the modem's management interface, and then upload the wiper malware. So here's an excellent example of a cyber war technique that basically relied upon attacking the management console to attacking the ground station, not attacking the satellite, but attacking the ground station, and then using that to be able to upload malware to all of those routers. And that's the end of the story.
I was going to say, that's great. I mean, it's a good example of like the real world versus like the YouTube or the cool stuff that people want to cover. It's like they didn't attack the satellite directly. They went like through a back door, right?
Exactly. And so they attacked essentially at the ground station and then use the satellite only as a way to get the malware into the routers. And so this has some, lessons for us.
Yeah.
One of them is that you need to patch, right? That's one lesson you need. And then two, for all of the people who are out there who are new and think that all these vulnerabilities are already patched, they aren't.
Yeah.
Okay. This one's 4 years later. 3 is that you need to do cyber threat intelligence. You need to be out there and watching what's happening in the real world.
Yeah.
Right? You need to understand there are a number of companies who just do this, you can buy subscription services to, and they will constantly track. What they do oftentimes is they have like these honeypots that are out there, and they're constantly monitoring those honeypots to see what attacks, what type of scans are taking place, right? So if you know what the bad guys are scanning for, you probably can't anticipate what the next attack is going to be, right? Yeah. If you can see the malware that they try to upload to your honeypot, then you have an idea of what your next attack is going to be. So cyber threat intelligence becomes really critical. We just finished a class on cyber threat intelligence at Hackers Rise. And so anybody who's really interested in that field, we've got a course specifically tuned to that. But it's really part of being well prepared and defending your network is to always pay attention to what's going on in the real world.
Yeah.
And then I guess the fourth lesson here is that those old attack techniques, okay, that you think they don't work anymore, like the directory traversal attack. Here's a good example of where it worked in this particular device. I have to, I'm disappointed in Fortnet that this is like cybersecurity 101. You don't allow people who connect to your web server to be able to go wherever they want on the server. You restrict where they go, and they had no restrictions, and they had the username and passwords in clear text. So if those username and passwords had been encrypted, it wouldn't have been that easy. They would have been able to download the hash, and they would have had to break the hash, and they probably could have done that. But giving people the username and passwords in plain text is just irresponsible.
It's ridiculous, especially on a firewall device.
So that's kind of what I'm talking about with Fortnet. You see a lot of these kinds of mistakes in their devices, right? And so this is a security device that's designed to keep your network secure, and they're storing the username and passwords in clear text, and they are not restricting where the unauthenticated user can go within the server, right? This is cybersecurity 101, right? So it's really disappointing to me to see this type of thing. I mean, yes, this was 2018. That's only 6 years ago, right? And this is not like 1998. This is just 6 years ago, and they had devices that you could do a directory traversal on, and then all of the devices were not updated. I guess it's not necessarily Fortinet's responsibility to make sure that all the devices are updated. But if you're a company who's selling a VPN, a firewall, and these types of simple attacks work against your devices, I think you have a responsibility to make sure that people are aware of it and that they do something about it, right? I mean, I know Fortnet put out a patch for this, and it's hard to make sure that people actually put the patches in place. But if you're selling these devices, you need to be persistent, I probably made the best word, and adamant that your users know about it and do something about it, because you're selling security. You're selling security, Fortnet, and you're allowing these devices to exist out there, and you put, in this case, a whole country at risk by not doing a good job with your devices. So I'll stop beating up on Fortnet here. And
I have to always counter what you say, right? Because earlier this year, Cisco also had a problem with their firewalls, right? And I mean, I'm just trying to think, there's some memes. Tom Lawrence put out a funny meme where he was saying, who's the next firewall vendor that gets popped? And he's like saying about VPNs being a bad idea. So what's your take on it? Would you recommend, is there any firewall vendor that you like, or would you recommend like having one vendor and then another firewall behind it with a different vendor? What's your take on firewalls?
Well, there's this whole concept of defense in depth, right?
Yeah.
And that you want to have multiple vendors and not just one vendor, because if the attacker can figure out how to get past, say, your Fortnet firewall, right, then if you have a second Fortnet firewall, they're going to get past that as well. So defense in depth requires that you have multiple devices with different vendors, right? So that's first thing I want to point out is defense in depth, multiple vendors. Two, I understand that Cisco's had their problems as well. And some of those attacks against Cisco firewalls have been relatively simple as well, but I don't think as bad as this one, at least my opinion is.
No, I mean, I've always like, just so that people don't think I'm so biased, I work a lot with Cisco and I obviously have a long history with Cisco and like Cisco stuff, but it's always good to balance it, right? But yeah, I mean, it's like, would you recommend Fortinet? I'm assuming not.
I would not. And I also think that it's important to note to everybody that there's a lot of people who assume that their VPN communications are secure.
Yeah, that's was my next question about VPNs, right? Sorry, go on.
Yeah, you cannot make that assumption that your VPN communications are secure. A lot of new people to cybersecurity go, well, I'm using a VPN and therefore it's secure, right? No, that's not necessarily the case. It might be, but there's also a good chance, and you need to keep in mind the possibility that it's not. We've seen a number of relatively simple attacks against VPNs, right, that have worked in the past, this one being an example. And of course, there's been a number of them against Cisco firewalls and VPNs as well. So don't make the assumption that you are safe just because you're using a VPN. There was a new news article today about the German law enforcement being able to identify users on the Tor network, okay? And so that's what I've been warning people. And I think I warned in Linux Basics for Hackers just that, right? That I talked about the Tor network and how it works. And I said, don't assume that you're necessarily anonymous on the Tor network. And we had an article came out just today about the German law enforcement being able to de-anonymize people on the Tor network, not necessarily seeing what they're doing, but determining who they are, what their identity is. And of course, it's not easy to do, but it can be done. So I'm just, once again, just re-emphasizing that if you're using one of these technologies to anonymize yourself, don't be certain, still be careful, because each of them has its weakness.
Actually, by the way, I wanted to ask you about VPNs. VPNs were like the old school way of doing it, where you have a firewall, you connect to the VPN, and then you're on the inside, right? There seems to be a lot of risk with that, and this is like just another example of that.
I would agree. It's a measure that we can take to be secure, but don't assume that that you're secure, and you need to take other measures as well to secure your communication, not just use a VPN. And for those of you who are using VPNs and say you're operating in a cyber war environment, don't assume that because you're using a VPN, you're secure, that they're not going to find your identity. That's really what's, I think, is one of the most important, because people get complacent when they're using a VPN. They go, I'm using a VPN, therefore nobody knows who I am. No, that's not true. And in the case of Tor, same thing applies, in that people think, oh, I'm using Tor, that I'm anonymous. No, that's not the case. But it's not easy, okay, in both cases, but it can be done.
OTW, as always, I really want to thank you for sharing. You have classes on satellite hacking and cyber threat intelligence and a whole bunch of other classes. Can you tell us a bit more about it? And of course, tell us about the discount that you've got running.
Well, we're offering everybody who watches your channel a 20% discount. Just use discount coupon BOMEAL, Bombal, David's last name, and that'll get you 20% off anything.
Right.
Our 3-year programs, one single video, a book, you can get 20% off on anything. Our cybersecurity starter bundle, which is very popular for people who are new to cybersecurity. But we offer I think we're up to like 65 classes now. So we have 65 different courses dealing with cybersecurity. One of the newest ones is satellite hacking. We have a very popular one coming up next month in IoT hacking, where we're going to be looking at all of those IoT devices in our homes, in our businesses that can be hacked and can be used for botnets and DDoS attacks, or using them to be able to connect to our internal network. Okay, they can pivot from your IoT device into your local area network and then possibly cause more havoc in your life.
So for everyone watching, I'll put links below. Go and sign up, get the discount. OTW's got so much knowledge and such a wide range of knowledge. We can all learn so much from him. OTW, thanks so much for sharing.
Thanks, David. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.